a second ago, they were this big.
I'm like, not. The audio is going to be interesting. Welcome to Politics on the Patio. I'm Andrew Swenson and I have Kent Rogert with me this week. Kent, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you kind of identify on the political spectrum?
Sure. So I own a lobby firm here in town. I've done that for about 10 years. Before that, I was a state senator from Tacoma, Nebraska, my home area. And I kind of got involved in politics as a kid. My dad ran a state legislative campaign when I was a teenager, so it's kind of always been with me. My identity on the political spectrum personally often differs from my business identification, so I'm often paid to have an opinion one way or the other. But I'm a pragmatist. When I ran for the legislature, I ran as a Democrat. I'm now currently an independent. I'm afraid to say that. I see both sides of the spectrum on a lot of the issues. I'm a realist, and I try to believe in and work for things that make sense and don't cause harm to other people necessarily. Yeah.
Great. Well, I consider myself a pragmatist too. So let's crack open our drinks here, and we can get started first with our next section. So,
all right.
cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Kent, for our current event section this week, we really wanted to talk about the whole immigration issue and children being separated from their families, and then some audio tape came out and then they weren't. So how do you see kind of the events playing out, and what do you think is happening?
So the events that I see playing out are awfully unpredictable. I mean, I don't think anybody predicted that we were going to allow our border officials to separate families at the borders as they're catching them. I also didn't realize they were catching 1,000, 1,500 of these folks a day. I mean, it's a deal. It's a big deal. For me, I like the acronyms that keep changing around, but I'm a believer in the whole thing. The Dreamers, I figure that if you made it through high school and college here as you were a citizen, ish citizen your entire life because your parents brought you over here, I think you should be allowed to have a citizenship. DACA, the Deferred Action for Child Arrivals that the Obama administration put in, I believe that's a good thing. To allow people to be here for 20, 30 years and then ask them or tell them that they're going back to a home that they don't have and never did have, I think is pretty cruel and inhumane.
So when you look at the situation, I understand that as a lobbyist, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that, you don't always have the freedom to say one thing or another, so I noticed a little bit of guardedness in your answer there.
Yep.
So can you maybe tell us a little bit about how that maybe plays into even how you're thinking about situations like this?
Well, I mean, I try to also think of the answer that makes sense, to me as a human, as a person, that says, well, what is the right way to handle this situation? And then I also sometimes got to go, well, how do I, because I actually have two jobs as a lobbyist. I have to lobby the legislature, and I have to lobby my client a little bit to say, hey, this is a bad idea to come in position A versus position B or position C, or maybe to even have a position at all. So how those things relate, I think I'm pretty open and honest with my clients and say, well, I think that's really a dumb position to have, but if that's what you want me to do, I'll go fight for it and have an argument for it all the way through. So does that kind of answer your question there?
Yeah. So I think specifically what I'm wondering is, it's okay to support the immigrants and that, but the current event in particular, where children were separated from their families as a policy decision. Well, I guess the president first said it wasn't a policy decision, and then he decided it was. What do you think that was about? Like, was it an actual policy that we should split these people apart, or what was happening there?
I can't imagine that it would have been an actual policy decision to do that. I understand that when you have the military and you have the executive branch that don't always communicate perfectly in the same order, that somebody was just following some rule that was written down some time ago that said, well, we have to put the children aside and talk to the parents, and it became something about putting the children in one place and the adults in the other. and it maybe didn't have anything to do with families. They were just doing an age group separation of sorts. And I can't imagine that there would have been somebody that said we have to pull the parents away from their children and put them in separate holding pens until we, and then send them back. I just don't know why that would have been.
But then I think what kind of troubles me is the argument afterwards came in and said, well, the people who are crossing the border are doing so illegally, so they're criminals.
Correct.
And in criminal cases, we must separate the parents from the children. So there became a sort of policy-like
Sure.
justification for
Sure.
it. So was that, do you think, like a what do we do with that? Because it feels like if this were something where people were just trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
and they split people, but then the administration was backing it up with a sort of policy-based argument.
Yeah, I always call that the CYA, the cover your bum type of thing. I think they're like going, somebody's talking to them and saying to make sure that they didn't maybe break the law while they were separating these folks. They said, well, that's the law that says you have to do that. So as fast as things kept changing in the media for the answers from the administration, it kind of flip-flopped in several different directions in the course of a few days. I don't think they knew what the heck was going on, and they were trying to figure out how to not get themselves in major trouble. And then, of course, I don't think that anybody can control what the president says. I think he just off the cuff throws things out there and says one thing, and then he goes back in an office and his advisors say, that's completely wrong. And they has to come back in and change and come back into there.
So I think it's easy for me. I think I am a pragmatist as well, but I look at things primarily from probably a further left version than where you're at. It's easy for me to assume intentionality in a lot of these decisions. I agree with you that often Trump will go out and say things that off the cuff that maybe don't have a lot of policy backing or it make a lot of sense. But what it sounds like you're saying, and I don't sense that you are defending the administration per se, but you're sort of giving an insight into maybe how some of this policy stuff works. Is that coming from your experience, or?
I would say my experience, not necessarily as participating, but just watching over the years. You just see things, and at all levels of government. The left hand so often does not talk to the right hand, and it happens just down the street at the state capitol all the time. You go to a agency office, and the answer there is different than from the governor's office than from a legislative office. So I think on the national level, it's just way more exploded that people just don't know what's going on across the hall.
But is there any way that we can fix that? Because the implication of it is the people's lives. Like, there are thousands of children who were separated from their parents, and now we still don't have a plan to get them reunited, right?
Yeah.
That's actual people's lives. It's not, I'm not asking you to fix it, but is there a path?
So the folks on the front line have to have sometimes limited and sometimes unlimited power to make a right decision then and there. And because sometimes you go to those people and you don't want them to be able to change the rules, because then bad things can happen. But sometimes they should be able to change the rules so bad things don't happen. And if you got to have people on the front line that have the ability to do that and then wish to do that. And I'm not saying that the people on the front lines were doing anything that they thought was right or wrong. They just didn't feel that they had the ability to change the rules for any sort of reason. I think that, and there needs to be a very direct and quick line of communication back and forth between the rule makers and the frontline folks, if there's a situation like that.
We're running long, but one thing I would want to know is a lot of people are...
Come on through.
Oh, you can come through, yeah. Sorry. Can you squish behind me? One of the things that's super troubling to me is that Republicans are agreeing with this, because I think it's just like blindly because it's something Trump said was good, and so we're just gonna do it. You know what I mean? So it's like, how do we separate?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Can you ask that?
Yeah, I
question?
think it can. So I think another thing that we've seen in this particular issue is that often the president will go out and say something, and then everybody else in his party will fall in line.
Right.
Like, regardless of And I'm sure in your line of work, you see that happening, whipping the votes and putting that all together.
Every day on both sides, sure.
Yeah. So, what is that? Are people really just changing their positions that way, or is this a part of a bigger strategy, or how does that work?
Folks that are making a party-based vote or decision, a lot of them don't at least present the courage to go off of the party line. I think some of them don't possess it. Some do and just don't present it. And the ones that do, often the party will attack their own and throw them out. And the president has made it very well known that people on his side that don't fall in line, he will run somebody from the party that's more in his line of work to get him out of office. And he has. He had a primary candidate that he was supporting versus one of our U.S. Senator Deb Fisher, and she said, "Good luck." And she was right, because she's not 100% behind him, but that's the way that it's done. So I wish it were different. I wish that people would be able to fully express and vote the way they want to, regardless of the party. But the party's pretty powerful, and they want to keep their jobs.
Do you think that Citizens United, was that the turning point for it, or did it still did it exist before that too?
No, that's the turning point. When the courts decided that a corporation was a person, and so I can only spend $2,400 a year on a presidential or a U.S. Senate candidate. My company can write unlimited checks. I just don't get that. Yeah, and until we get a court that decides that we have to change campaign finance, and we're just going to have to fight through it.
Yeah.
So Kent, for our next section, I'm going to rapid fire ask you some questions.
Okay.
And you're going to tell me whether the thing is good for the world or bad for the world. And if you want to explain, you can. If you don't want to, you're also free to pass.
All right.
So the first one, the World Cup coming to North America.
Well, I think that's good for the world, because the United States has a lot of people spending a lot of money, and people in the United States aren't paying a whole lot of attention to the World Cup right now, and when it's here, they will. So good.
Movie pass.
Good for the world. I love it. I have one.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, they're coming out with a guest thing just starting tomorrow. Bring a guest.
I don't have it yet, so maybe we can be friends.
Yeah.
The escalating trade war rhetoric between the U.S. and China.
Bad for the world. I don't think I have to explain that.
Yeah. Man buns.
Bad for the world. I want them all to go away so badly.
I think I could picture.
No, I have a hole in my hair up there, but yeah.
All right. Emoji. The emojis that go.
Great for the world. Great for the world. I love them.
Yeah, really? Even though teenagers sometimes just converse completely in pictures?
Yeah, it may not be good for the world, but it is fun for me and my 13-year-old niece to have conversations in those that are ridiculous. Yeah.
Melania Trump's I don't care jacket.
Bad choice. I don't know that she did that on purpose, but because of it, I would say bad for the world.
All right. Bitcoin.
I don't know. I would say that neither. I don't think it has an effect one way or the other, really.
Okay.
Today anyway.
The U.S. leaving the Human Rights Council at the UN.
Bad for the world. I think that's just a bad idea. I mean, we keep pulling out these things, and I actually don't know a whole lot about it and the backstory why we would have, but on first glance, I'd say bad.
Amazon.
Oh, well, good for the world as long as small. Everybody's got to change with the times, and I come from a small town where we don't have any retail stores in town anymore, or very few, and so we have to figure out a way to change with that, but we'll get there.
Okay. All right, last one, Red Bull.
Red Bull gives you wings, great for the world.
All right.
Yeah.
So, Kent, for the policy issue today, we are going to talk about some cannabis.
All right.
So,
all right.
You had mentioned when we were talking earlier that you're interested in how cannabis maybe interacts with being legal for medicinal use, especially as it's related to the opioid crisis. So why don't you give us an overview of what you're thinking of from a policy position, and then we can go from there.
Well, we know that we have a major problem with opioids. We have had for a long time. We're just finally starting to be able to be happy about talking about it. So that's a thing. And there are other things that I think we can do to get around the opioid crisis too. But medical marijuana, or marijuana used in a medical form, has shown to be very useful in lots of different medical problems. So, post-cancer treatments, epilepsy, some folks with some pretty serious debilitating diseases, and the way that we've written the law in almost every state is a medical use, almost. I say almost. Some of them are pretty loosey-goosey. And especially the bill that's tried to be introduced and passed in Nebraska the past couple of years is very specific to a very few things, and even very specific to the actual type of marijuana that can be used. It has to be the oil type, there's no smoking, all these types of things. But so there are some folks that are just so scared that we're gonna open up the door to some massive drug-related haze, across the state. And it's not addictive, it's not a gateway drug, and it's shown at least positive aspects of helping a lot of people.
So, from a policy position, I have a couple of questions. Why do you think it took? Because this conversation really did kick up when we saw the opiate crisis spike. Why do you think it took that to get us to a place where we're saying, well, maybe let's consider cannabis?
Well, unfortunately, all too often, at least in Nebraska, a very conservative, slow-moving state, which is good on a lot of ways, we are not often proactive enough, but rather reactive. We always seem to be coming forth to solve a problem rather after it's already created, a disaster's happened, and then instead of trying to get ahead of it. And I think we've seen some pretty, and it doesn't seem to be really a big issue, a huge issue in Nebraska, but we've seen what's happened in other states and other countries where this is really a big deal, and they're like, whoa, we gotta find a way to stop this now. And finally some actual medical professionals have said, hey, I've been talking about this stuff for a long time as an alternative to that. Maybe we ought to start the conversation on a higher level.
Okay, so I think as a pragmatist too, what do you think scares, there's a few states now where both recreational and medical use is legal, but what do you think is the driving force behind limiting bills like that so narrowly to be, here's just this little bit of medicinal use, when the things that you had said earlier, it's not addictive, all the other stuff. I think that's also the same argument that other states have used to legalize it for recreational use. Yeah. Where do you think the split there comes for, we should only do it for medical versus?
This is a funny but pretty true way of looking at things. If you look at the demographics of our elected officials in this state and across the country, it is literally a bunch of old white men, and whose recollections of marijuana lead back to the 60s, and where it was new and everybody went crazy on certain things, and marijuana, cocaine, those types of issues, and we made movies about it for years, about how it can be just ridiculous, and they fear that that's going to happen. It's going to be their fault, that they created an opening for Cheech and Chong in reality to take over the world, and that's really what it is. And some of the religious groups have grasped on, and some and in Nebraska we're just a very slow to change world. It just takes a lot of attempts, and so they also they can't get it into their brains that there's a difference between marijuana and pills that people get hooked on, and they just think that that's going to happen. If we open this up, nobody's going to go to work again for the rest of our life. We're just going to fall apart.
So you're saying that, because I don't have as generous of a read maybe on it, but you're saying that they really have a legitimate fear that this could turn into a public health crisis? Right? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. And maybe they didn't until somebody who's opposed to this for whatever reason scared the crap out of them. They say, and there are some Western Nebraska senators that spend as much time in Denver as anywhere else, and they see some issues with the recreational use everywhere, and again, they can't separate it in their heads. Like, we're not even asking for recreational use. We're asking for medicinal use, and these things have a possibility of helping some people. It's just a very hard conversation to get to connect.
So, do you think any of this is also motivated from sort of the Jeff Sessions Attorney General policy position that, the Obama guidance to the Justice Department was, let them do, back off. The Jeff Sessions Justice Department is more like, you can decide on your own if you want to go after anybody in your state or not, which I imagine for, those in states where it's legal is kind of scary to know that at any moment a USA might be knocking on your door with a warrant. What do you think that plays in anybody's decision making at this point?
Probably. Now, what I would tell you is that I think both of those policies is pure ass chicken crap. That the President Obama did not have the courage to go in, and if he thought that we should have legalized it, he should have had a policy initiative to legalize it. Jeff Sessions, if he thinks that we should make it fully enforced, then we should make it fully enforced. I mean, neither one of them have, all they've done is created this, I don't know what's going on in every state. They really, because for sure, the Attorney General here, or the people who are trying to get it here or against it, they're like, well, if we make it legal and our U.S. Attorney at the time says we're going to fully enforce it, we're going to have the DEA all over the state, then that doesn't do anybody any good. And I get that. So yeah, I think the policy at a federal level is it's flawed at a major level, and it should be addressed by Congress or by the courts or by the executive branch, one way or the other, but nobody is.
I think I do have to, sort of from a systemic perspective, there is kind of a tie for me in this debate about the people who want to, and I'm not accusing any one particular person of anything in particular, but just the history of sort of Schedule I of cannabis and the illegality of it relates to race in some ways, because we've seen that you're far more likely if you're black and use marijuana to be arrested than if you're white. There are way more African Americans in prison for low-level drug crimes than there are white people.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes the argument gets to be, and especially with Jeff Sessions, I'm not asking you to comment on him in particular, but with his background and some of the racial stuff, I think some people can read that as racially motivated, that Jeff Sessions wants to keep this illegal because it helps him to advance a different agenda. Do you see any of that playing out in here or other places in Washington?
I don't see that here, but I can totally buy that on the national scene for sure. Here, it's literally just dragging an anchor that's the size of a house through the sand, and it's just very, very hard to do new things here. But on a national level, yeah, there's a lot of shading and bait and switch and all that stuff going on. So yeah, I can pull for that for sure. Yeah.
So what do you think it would take to get a bill through the legislature in Nebraska?
It takes just a swing in a particular electoral set for a certain election.
So I'm gonna stop right there.
Oh, yeah.
So you're saying like if the legislature looks like it does today, going forward, let's just assume the sort of makeup is similar.
Correct.
There's not an argument that's going to change those people's minds.
Not very likely. Right.
Okay, so it's not about argumentation; it's about different people being in the office.
It's about the personalities being there. Yeah, and it varies, and it's literally just a few. I mean, 5 minds over here makes all the difference. I mean, if you need so many to overcome and pass and get it through, and we're just short of that. If this election cycle changes a little bit, it may happen.
So this is really interesting because I think oftentimes we think about, I call my Congress people all the time. Sometimes when I call, they say, "Is this Andrew again?" So they know me very well,
Yep.
but I feel always like I'm making an argument to a staffer who's going to pass it on, maybe, and
Maybe.
like I don't know if that's actually doing any good.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is 5 people in a legislature could change the whole swing of where this legislation goes. Maybe not just on this issue, but others.
On all kinds of them.
Right. So I think sometimes we focus all of our effort into, I mean, now we're stuck with who we're stuck with
Yep.
in lobbying them as they go forward and trying to change their minds. But
Yep.
really where most of the power comes is who we select in the first place, right?
100%. 100%. Because, you know, I figure over here there's 49, there's 20 on the left, 20 on the right, and not quite that many, but more like 25 and 15. But there's 15 in the middle that are very moderate and pragmatic, may go one way or the other on any particular issue, or with even if they care about it or not. So yeah, it's very, and you move 2 here and 2 here to the middle, and you win.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's have another drink of that.
All right.
And we'll move on to our last section.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Kent, thank you so much for the quick conversation today. I really appreciated you
Yeah,
coming
this
and
was fun.
sharing your experience with us. So the last thing before we do, we always ask our guests to give us 3 recommendations for things people could read, watch, listen to get a better understanding of you and your way you see the world.
Sure, you bet. Well, probably my favorite TV show of all time, and I've watched it. I'm still watching it. I watch it over and over and over. It's on Netflix now. Is The West Wing. So in terms of what, you know, the way I kind of think over there, probably gives a little clue of which way I go, but it also shows that I'm also a pretty big believer in common sense, and I really have a heart for, you know, people's troubles and those types of things. So you could do that. You probably could go to a Zac Brown concert and watch me singing and pretending like I know how to play guitar and banjo, which I really don't. But those are, you know, that type of fast moving but good melody and harmony and stuff like that makes my life go smooth. And then literally take a trip to Lake of the Ozarks, because that's my favorite place in the world. If I could live anywhere, that's where I go.
Can you do just that, the Lake of the Ozarks?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to
Yeah.
do that one more time.
I'd say, then I just tell everybody to take a trip to Lake of the Ozarks. It's my favorite place in the world. I've been there at least once or twice a year for the past 20-some years. It's great. Being out on the water, just going barefoot and shirtless and hopping from one place to the other via water. You can buy your groceries in a boat. I mean, it's great. So that probably wraps up my world pretty solidly.
Well, thanks so much. One last cheers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll see you around.
All right, thanks guys.
Well, folks, it's time to kick it old school.
That was a little awkward for me. But
It's just real life.
It is
Yeah.
real life.
how we doing?
Are you ready or do you need some time to think?
You know his older brother?
Yeah.